morning, delighted to be here today with Rachel Botsman. Rachel, how are you?
I am very good. It's a lovely autumn, bright, cold morning, my favourite.
As you're inside, nicely wrapped up.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Tell us about your journey into the world of trust.
Long story short, it started around 12 years ago, where I was looking at, and they were baby companies at the time, companies like Airbnb, Uber, even companies like Netflix and eBay and Zipcar that were really using technology to change our relationship to trust, change how we could travel, how we could access things. And that led to a whole body of work on the sharing economy and really understanding how trust works in digital platforms. And that was fascinating. And I did that for 5 years, and then became more interested in sort of broader macro questions around trust in society. So why were people saying that they didn't trust the media and they didn't trust government? But why were things like Brexit and Trump happening, like really strange sort of trust manifestations? So I became slightly obsessed with this question of who can you trust, with a very big question mark, and why can that relationship be manipulated? And that led to my second book, Who Can You Trust? And now my work has changed again. And I think this was happening before the pandemic, but I was really interested in trusting cultures. So what did a high trust culture look like? What did a high trust relationship between a leader and their team look like? But more interestingly, what does trust in yourself really mean? And that people who understand that and understand the role of uncertainty and doubt have actually not just coped better, but in many ways have thrived in life's unknown. So that has led to a whole new body of research around our relationship between trust and uncertainty and what that really looks like.
So I suppose it neatly leads on to the pandemic, and I suppose the last 20 months where we've been living. How important is trust for ourselves and for companies today in this new virtual world that we've been existing in?
I'm not just saying this because this is my passion subject, but trust is like social glue in any time. And when it's missing, particularly when you're asking people to cope with so much change and uncertainty, people struggle on all kinds of levels. And I've seen this with teams. So teams that adapted pretty well to working virtually. There was either a foundation of trust there, or in many ways, actually, this was really good for trust because you didn't have sort of the physical constraints of an office. Leaders had to learn how to communicate with their staff in different ways. Teams had to learn new forms of cooperation and collaboration. And the basis of that is trust. The opposite of that, and not, these were great case studies. No one wanted this pandemic to happen, but the teams I saw really struggle is when people were like, what are you up to? The micromanagement and the extreme of that, surveillance, where they had to keep their cameras on to actually know that they were sitting there all day. So trust is everything in terms of the working relationships, but it's also coming back to this trust in yourself. Trust in yourself is not about not having any doubts. This idea of self-doubt being sort of a baddie in our lives is actually completely wrong. It's actually being able to live with those doubts and live with those questions, be able to push through and really be able to live in the unknown. So trust really is everything in times of uncertainty, and not to mention trust in public health and politicians and the financial system and companies. There's a whole other realm to it as well.
How have you had to adapt yourself in terms of your lecturing or your speaking so that actually you gain our trust and you can deliver the messages you used to be able to deliver on stage?
To be honest, teaching really was a gift. Like learning how to teach virtually, I think, has really helped with the speaking. I'm not going to lie, like the first term I was doing this, I was so frustrated. I was just really pushing against. I wanted those students in the classroom. And, I have 80 students in my class all around the world, different time zones, in very different situations. And I think there was a shift when I realized, okay, I cannot teach the class that I teach in the classroom online. So I have to redesign the class to actually work in a hybrid format. That was step one. The second was, well, what tools do I have available to me that I can't do in a physical classroom? And that was fascinating when I started to use, just on Zoom, like very simple interactive functions. So one was actually chat. And Adam Grant, who's a good friend of mine, he taught me how to do this. So I said, I'm really struggling with the students that don't speak up. In the classroom, I can read their faces and I can sort of help them raise their voices. And he said, oh, you should try this thing. And it's a simple hashtag thing where you go hashtag on fire, which is when they really want to jump in, hashtag aha, which is when they've had what we call rethink moments, so a really big insight, and hashtag debate, which means they want to challenge something a student or I said. And I tell you, Nick, it was fascinating because I've never been so challenged at the front of the classroom. So that led to a whole series of questions. Students raised their voices in a way that I'd never heard before. And I also could read a bad class, right? Because if I didn't have any hashtags rethink or aha, it was a really rubbish class and I had to go back and think about what happened. And all that helped me with the speaking, thinking about, right, I cannot take an on-stage presentation and I'm being quite tough with clients and going, it's just not going to work. So how do I redesign everything from how the slides look to how I can interact with people to my energy and feeling that it's down the camera now, right? So how do you create that kind of connection? And I think it took 9 months to really get there, to actually say I can confidently deliver this virtually in the same way I've done 10 years on the stage. As soon as my feet hit the stage, my body knows what it's doing. And I think that's been the lesson, is you cannot just take an onstage performance, because it is a performance. You have to really think of it as a design challenge. And for me, that's been fun. Once you sort of push against what you can't, you let go of what you can't do.
You were in our last showcase prior to the pandemic. And I distinctly remember probably kind of, you asked the audience a question of who they trusted, or you kind of Facebook against Amazon. Obviously for the last year, kind of, there's been a lot going on for these type of companies. What's your feeling towards it, and how are they succeeding or failing in making themselves more trustworthy?
I'm always hesitant to lump them all in the same bucket. And I think it is really interesting where you can see sort of the tech companies trying to move away from one another. So, Mark Benioff at Salesforce coming out, actually saying, Facebook is dangerous to the whole tech industry. I do think, though, there is a consistent pattern where they are still somewhat blaming. In trust, we talk about capability and character. So how you do things and why you do things. And I still think their defense is about the system, the platform, versus the culture and character question. And what is shifting now, and you're seeing this sort of in the media, and you're seeing this in sort of, I think we're on the cusp of a very big regulatory change, is this question of integrity. That if you do not change your business model, your interest, the way you make money, the way you hold people's attention, the way you use their data is not aligned with the public interest. So potentially sort of free speech and misinformation, I am not saying that they are incredibly important, but this question of public interest and health interest, I think, is going to move the needle in terms of regulation and change. And this is where I think any company that's facing a trust challenge, if they keep coming out with capability defenses, it was the product, it was the system, and don't acknowledge something that's going on in their culture, incentives, behavior, leadership, the public doesn't move on. We see this banking, tech, pharma, whatever it may be, the systemic cause is always very similar.
What do you see, I suppose, the future of trust for leaders? Are there any people out there who you feel are actually moving the dial in the space of trust going forward?
A big leadership trait, and this I think is really interesting, that we're starting to see rise up. So there's different traits that research tracks in terms of why people trust them. And the employer and employee relationship, that trust relationship, has never been more important. For a few reasons. People are leaving their jobs in the masses. We're seeing this great resignation. But also, if you think about where trust issues often lie, it's often an employee now speaking up, like that's the loyalty issue. So how leaders earn that trust is a really big question. And it's really interesting because this trait is rising up of humility. which I think is fascinating. So the way I define humility is it's a confident relationship with what we don't know. So it's not a leader that sort of is incapable or is sort of inconsistent and all over the place. It's a leader that has the confidence that when they don't have the information in front of them to make a good decision, they're honest about that. They say, I'm not sure. And I think that's been accelerated in the pandemic because people have looked at politicians and said, well, basically, you lied to us, right? Or you pretended you knew the outcome. And that false certainty didn't help us. Things were always changing. So when a leader really demonstrates humility, it is like superpower for trust. It's fuel. It completely accelerates that relationship. And we're seeing this everywhere. I mean, I'm not a football nut, but I think Gareth Southgate is a really interesting example of leadership driven by humility, right? He never promises to win. He leads that team with, he's taken arrogance out of it. And you saw the power of that because even when England lost, everyone was proud of the team, right? You look at the papers the next day. And so this is really interesting to me, how humility, particularly during times of uncertainty, can really be a superpower when it comes to trust.
Thank you so much indeed for your time today. Always a pleasure speaking to you, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks, Nick.